So continuing the Future of Financial Intelligence Sharing series of interviews for Leadership in Partnership, where we're engaging with individuals who've established partnerships, individuals who are innovating and improving the effectiveness or operations of financial information sharing partnerships to disrupt crime. I'm delighted that we're joined by Jeroen Rijpkema, who will be representing the Dutch Banking Association in this presentation to talk about the Transaction Monitoring NL utility. And Baldwin Kramer, speaking alongside Jeroen, Deloitte have been driving a lot of the work behind this initiative. So fantastic to have you both on this call.
Hey Nick, thanks for having us.
Yes, Nick, thank you very much, and delighted to have this opportunity. I'm very happy to be able to share with the audience our thoughts about transaction monitoring Netherlands utility, and I hope that we are also able to inspire people to have the same passion as we have about this initiative and the game-changing approach we want to take. Maybe to start with the first slide, it's important to state that what are we focusing upon. When you look at the whole framework of client integrity, we will focus with transaction monitoring, like the word is saying, on transaction monitoring only. So the continuous monitoring and screening of transactions. We will not focus on the other parts of the client integrity framework. So I think that's an important one. And secondly, it's important to state that in the Netherlands, we focus on unusual transactions. So the Dutch banks are obliged by law to report unusual transactions to the Financial Intelligence Unit and not say suspicious transactions. It's up to the FIU to decide whether an unusual transaction is a suspicious transaction, yes or no. So we started actually this journey, and I call it especially a journey because I think it's a long road ahead of us still. In 2018, where a few banks together with the Dutch Central Bank came together and said, well, the whole effectiveness of all our activities on transaction monitoring is just not good enough. If we see how many transactions we monitor, how many alerts we generate, and how that materializes ultimately in suspicious transactions with the FIU, and then also with real prosecution and conviction, we all have to contribute to strengthen the chain and to enhance the effectiveness of the chain. And especially in the Netherlands, it's important because we also had some research on the amounts being money laundered. And for a small country like the Netherlands, it is still a shocking amount of about 16 billion every year. And this is what we have been able to detect through the financial system. It is not including the money laundering outside the financial system. So for the Netherlands, it's an enormous amount. And just to give you a comparison, the Dutch government spends on justice and security every year 13 billion. So we have more money laundered in the Netherlands than that we spend together on the whole legal and police system. So the 5 banks, being ABN AMRO, ING, Rabo, Triodos and Volksbank, under the leadership of the Dutch Banking Association and supported as of day one by Deloitte, they have started to think, how can we enhance the effectiveness of the monitoring of about 12 billion transactions, which is about 33 million a day, through the system. And we took a well-phased approach. First, we started at end of 2018 with a feasibility study. So if you want to enhance the effectiveness, what should you do? Should you exchange knowledge with each other? Should you exchange know-how on IT system, artificial intelligence, machine learning, maybe also create a shared platform? Or should you, next to those two things, also share transaction data? And ultimately, in February 2019, the banks decided if you really want to enhance effectiveness and quality of the transaction monitoring, you should do all three. So share information together, create a common platform, and share the transaction data. That is the real breakthrough you can create to enhance effectiveness.
And Jeroen, when you were coming up with this approach, was it very much led by the banks? Was it bottom up from the financial institutions? Or was this strategy very much informed by public agencies?
No, I think credits where credits are due. I think the leadership was taken by the Dutch central bank, but definitely also based on their conversations with the individual banks who were investing significant amounts of money, time, and resources. And at the same time, we're also stating that about 95% of the alerts are false positives. And if you then see what we report to the FIU, what ultimately ends up in prosecution is relatively low. So what can we do together on enhancing the effectiveness? But the initiative was taken by the Dutch central bank through various roundtable conversations. And you hear me stressing several times effectiveness. I think it's also important that as of day one, the banks were clear that they want to indeed enhance effectiveness and the quality of the alerts. They are not looking for cost savings or efficiency. Of course, we won't rule it out if we can achieve it, but the shared vision is about enhancing effectiveness. So once we came up with this feasibility study, the banks decided in February 2019, let's indeed go for the full Monty. So sharing information, sharing platforms, and sharing data. And then together with the support of Deloitte, who has been involved as of day one, we started to work on the fundament, as we call it, and say, listen, if we then are going to enhance effectiveness of transaction monitoring, what are we actually talking about? And we said, well, we will focus on all the bank accounts being held in the Netherlands and the transactions running through those bank accounts, irrespective whether these accounts are being held by a resident or non-resident people. But for instance, a client having an account in Belgium with ING, that account is not being included. But if it's a Belgian client having an account with ING in the Netherlands, then that account is being included. So it only focuses on accounts in the Netherlands of the 5 mentioned banks. We also decided that we will create a standalone organization with a standalone IT setup. And well, some other decisions we took, one also very fundamental, we will start this with 5 parties, but once we have the platform up and running, we will also investigate how we can open it up to other parties in the financial industry in the Netherlands. So it's clearly meant to become a platform for all banking transactions in the Netherlands and not limited only to those 5 parties.
Jeroen, and those initial members, just to give stakeholders outside of the Netherlands a sense, how big a proportion of transaction reporting would those financial institutions represent?
Well, officially that is a bit of sensitive competitive information if you would share that with everyone individual, but I think it is fair to state that more than 3/4 of the total transaction volume in the Netherlands, if not more than 80%, is being run through these 5 banks.
So with a small manageable starting group, you're able to cover the vast majority of the network of transactions.
Definitely.
Great.
So after say phase 2, where we said these are the principles for our cooperation, we made a memorandum of understanding, and then together with the support of Deloitte, we started on designing the whole setup. The IT design, the organizational design, the financial design, but we also had a keen eye on working together with public parties because the Dutch legislation at this moment does not allow for certain aspects of transaction monitoring Netherlands, including outsourcing and sharing of data. So Baldwin will come back to that later on, but we had also a good cooperation and strong support from the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Justice and Security to prepare also legislative adjustments, which are still to be realized in the coming 1.5 years. We concluded phase 3, so the design and the financials and all other things, June this year. And then beginning of July, the banks signed an agreement whereby they said, well, we are committed to establish this company and we are committed to start realizing it in this transaction monitoring Netherlands in a very phased approach. before we could take that decision, we also first had to validate whether the assumption that by combining data, you would be better able to discover and detect criminal money flows and criminal networks, whether that is really true, yes or no, because that's the basic assumption we had. And I think this is a good moment to hand over to Baldwin, and maybe Baldwin can tell us how we have done so.
Thanks, Jeroen. I think, Nick, underlying, let's say, the whole idea and concept of TMNL is the assumption that combining data and doing analytics jointly is much better than doing it in silos. But obviously, it's a very important, let's say, premise to actually test. And that's where we did a proof of concept, where we actually brought data from the 5 participating banks together in a pseudonymized way, and then test 3 hypotheses, if you will. First of all, can we in fact bring that data together in a central location in a safe and valid way? Secondly, with pseudonymization in place, can we combine the data into a single data set that still makes sense? And thirdly, I guess the heart of the matter, combining those transactions and doing monitoring on it, is it actually better than the siloed approach? So we used, and you see it here on the slide, 5 different types of analytics to actually test the difference between monitoring in silos and monitoring in a joint database. And it's probably good to highlight some of the results of that. So first of all, what we see is that joint monitoring is indeed better than monitoring in silos. So the gut feel was right. So basically, it's important to notice that if you take what banks are currently doing in silos, which typically is more of a rule-based approach, and bring that approach to the joint database, it will in fact increase the effectiveness, but only so much. So we notice that if you go into the more advanced type of analytics, such as network analytics and outlier detection, that's where you really see the big jump. And most importantly, you will see undetected, at least until that date, undetected networks that you can actually notice. And that's obviously like the type of evidence that we wanted to see, that the actual effectiveness of monitoring is better on a joint database. At the same time, it also makes sense that we go to sharper detection and less false positives. And a very basic element of it is that if Jeroen just mentioned that the majority of the transactions are in the database, banks currently probably look at the same transaction twice. So there's always a very simple aspect to that. So you can probably deduplicate, if you will, a lot of those alerts and only have to look at them once. That makes perfect sense. And at the same time, the network analytics, the outlier approach, and the statistical analytics on it really gave a boost in monitoring. The third,
Baldwin, on that approach, so once you've got that opportunity for a central view of the flow of transactions, is the model that individual analysts within financial institutions then are able to look at that comprehensive picture and run their own investigations? Or is the view that collectively this new joint venture, this new company runs the investigations on behalf of the community? How do you see that working?
Well, I think at this stage, Nick, the design is still open to some extent. So in the conversations we had with the banks, with the FIU, for instance, they said it would be great if you would have that view on a network, for instance, of unusual or suspicious transactions, that you would report them directly from what I would call the utility, because that would enable the FIU to have the full network visible at once. So at this very moment, the way we've set up the reporting process is that individual banks, if you will, those networks are being broken down into individual transactions per bank, which are then reported to the FIU, which is the current structure. And then it's up to the FIU to bring the network back together. And we're going to demonstrate or show the intended roadmap in a bit. But one of the design choices, which is still to be made, whether the utility can actually act as a reporting entity to the FIU.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. So I think one last aspect to consider is that if you have those transactions in a single database, if you look at the bigger, if you will, laundering schemes such as the laundromats, this will also enable you to have much more of a macro view on how dirty money, if you will, is entering the Netherlands, exiting the Netherlands. So it also, I would just say, enable the Dutch government and participating banks to have a much better view of holistic view on exposure to money laundering in the Netherlands. So that's on the proof of concept. So we finalized the proof of concept, and based on the results, the banks felt comfortable that indeed this was a project to continue, given the benefits of the joint monitoring. With that, we still have some legislative adjustments and approvals. Let me just highlight some of them specifically for the Netherlands. So first of all, the Dutch AML regulation at this very moment prohibits banks from outsourcing their transaction monitoring. So that's obviously something that with the help of, the legislator, we're very confident that we will be able to clear that particular roadblock. But at this very moment, that is still an issue. Secondly, interbank sharing of data between, let's say, the private partners in relation to what we call like the tipping off prohibition is still something we need to work on to get clarity on what are the boundaries if you talk about information sharing on those unusual patterns and transactions. So privacy is probably a very important element of what we do. We bring a lot of transaction data together. So one of the main concerns of the bank has been privacy and security. So we had a very thorough look of privacy enhancing techniques. I think that this is a whole different series that you have from Rosie. Very interesting. So we've been deploying those techniques and did a very robust DPIA, if you talk about the proof of concept. And that's very much at the heart of, let's say, the risks that we see and that we need to manage within TMNL. And then there's also an aspect of competition law. And Jeroen mentioned that if you talk about an industry utility for the banks in the Netherlands, we need to define criteria that banks need to abide to in order to join the utility. But basically the principle is it's open to the banking industry, but we have to define the criteria to be able to join the TMNL initiative. So if you look at the intended roadmap, so the banks are working now what we call like an MVP phase, where we focus on alert generation that banks at this very moment cannot do individually. We call it like interbank alerts. And those are the alerts that you can only see when you do network detection in a joint monitoring pool. And I just mentioned that at this very moment, it is not allowed to outsource transaction monitoring. So the existing process at the bank will stay exactly as they are for at least like 18 to 24 months, or at least until the law changed. And we're going to help banks sort of augment their current transaction monitoring with those interbank alerts. And it's sort of on top of what they currently do. And then obviously the potential next steps would be, and we just had a quick discussion on that, Nick. So advanced monitoring, full service monitoring, which would potentially include alert handling, and then at some stage, potentially also reporting to the FIU. But those are design choices that we will see in the near future. So with that, I think probably good, Jeroen, to give it back to you and sort of look back on the initiative so far with some lessons learned.
Okay, thank you very much, Baldwin. Yeah, as you can imagine, there is a lot to share with you, but we are also restricted in a certain time frame. But if I see what we have achieved with each other, say in 2 years, from idea to real decision on starting a company and building it, there are, I think, a number of lessons to be learned. I think it all starts with a shared vision and a common goal. And the shared vision was that by the Dutch Central Bank and the 5 banks associated, we need to strengthen the whole chain of detection, prosecution, conviction, and taking away the money from criminals. That has been leading all the way, and also a clear understanding of the common goals. Everyone was focused on enhancing effectiveness and quality, and we were just not focused on side effects or other goals. This was leading, and as you can imagine, in 2 years' time, there are always some hiccups and discussions, and then we always came back to the shared vision and the common goal. Why are we doing this? This is not about cost saving, or this is not about a short-term result. This is about a long-term view. Together as banks, in cooperation with the public sector, we want to protect the integrity of the financial system, and we want to make the Dutch financial market a safer place than currently we see with the 16 billion of money laundering taking place every year. It's also important in these kind of discussions to have executive sponsorship at the top of the banks, because as you can imagine, many banks can have employees with different views, but ultimately the shared vision, the common goals were also shared by the managing boards of those 5 involved banks and the Dutch Central Bank. And they took also at important moments executive decisions and said, listen, we're not going to have a long fight about the budget, for instance. We will make things available if need be and if well justified. The strong culture of willingness to cooperate between the private sector and the private public sector, especially in this domain of fighting economic and financial crime, is, I think, another important lesson to be learned. There is no competitive challenge in this area. We all feel that we have to team up to make the financial sector a safer place. We had a lot of support of people within the banks. I cannot stress enough how impressed I have been. I think for the last year, we have been working with about 150 people on this project, all coming from the banks. And next to their normal work during the Corona crisis, people were just committed, be it legal people, be it IT people, be it financial people, be it AML people. Amazing, the passion we were able to transplant to these people and the energy they brought to the table. A number of other things, I won't go through all the details, but I think 2 I would like to highlight. The proof of concept was, I think, the turning point. You can have a lot of discussion, you can have a lot of belief, but like Baldwin rightfully so said, and I think there Deloitte helped us a lot because we ran the proof of concept with Deloitte. If you can really put meat on the table and say, listen, we have proof that if you combine the databases of 5 banks, that we are able to detect things which none of the banks individually was able to detect, you have undeniable proof. And that made a lot of discussions easier once we had that proof on the table. And the other thing is, we were also very clear, and still are very clear, there will be no compromise on data privacy and security. So also with the data exchange, we deliberately chose to limit ourselves. And of course, there were also always a little bit of pressure. Can we also do this, or can we also get that data? And we said, listen, we are not going to compromise by any means on data privacy and security, because I think the vital aspect, the conditio sine qua non for this whole initiative is to ensure under all circumstances public support. We do this for the Netherlands. We do this for protecting the integrity of the financial system. But you are dependent on the support of public parties, but also the public at large. Once people feel not comfortable anymore with these kind of utilities, you will lose the support, and then the whole initiative will not be based on solid ground. So you really need to ensure that you will not compromise data privacy and security, and that the public feels as safe as they now feel with individual banks. And I think there we were very good. So we're very excited now to move on and to really start building. And I hope that we have also been able to convey a little bit of our passion and our belief in this approach. And I would very much encourage other countries to have alike discussions. And if you are in need for additional information, then please reach out to Rusi, to Nick, and Baldwin, and I will always be available through Rusi to see how we can help you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking us through that, Jeroen and Baldwin. Some questions just to kind of tease some of this out, but overall, it's grabbed the attention of a lot of stakeholders around the world. First, when you profiled the idea, and then when you were able to get the agreement earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, for the commitment to set up the company. So there is a lot of international interest, and the passion that you bring to the project is very clear. In terms of the proof of concept, just to clarify that, was that on synthetic data, or were you able to run that on real data?
So Nick, so we used actual data from the participating banks. So a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, it was a data set that went through a lot of scrutiny. If you talk about, to Jeroen's point, the privacy and security aspects. So it was what we call like pseudonymized data set. And based on some privacy enhancing techniques, we were able to, if you will, combine the data after pseudonymization. So it was a real life, if you will, data set, which the benefit, I guess, was, and that's why we did it, because we fed back some of the observations that we had on the analytics to the banks, and they were able to actually see whether they missed, if you will, some risk indicators in those transactions or those clients. And indeed, in some of those transactions that we highlighted using the analytics, banks said, you know what, this indeed is very interesting to look at. So that's why it was really helpful to do it on live data. So banks were able actually to look in their client files whether or not they missed a red flag, or indeed could augment their existing monitoring. Yeah,
very, very interesting.
And if I may add something to it, in the good cooperation, the parties and also Deloitte had built up with public parties, we were also able to run a few of their typologies on the database. And we were also able to show that by strengthening the cooperation between private and public, with these typologies, we are able to, as we said, enhance the effectiveness and create better quality, because we saw certain networks which were not in view yet, but with these typologies we discovered some new networks.
Very interesting. You're obviously familiar with the RUSI Future of Financial Intelligence Sharing research project on privacy enhancing technology, and we engage with a lot of data scientists and those who are not familiar with financial crime. You know, there's almost a disbelief that the system is set up in a way that the analysis takes place on fragmented data, and you're trying to see a problem across the system. It kind of doesn't make sense from the technologist's perspective, and it takes some explaining to explain how we got here. But very interesting on the proof of concept. In terms of the interaction with public agencies, do you see TMNL as taking place prior to the filing of unusual reports, or do you see there being a very symbiotic relationship between, feeds and information from public agencies and the analysis taking place within TMNL?
Now, I think at this moment, and add on please, Baldwin, in a minute, I think at this moment we still have a pretty strict distinction in the Netherlands between responsibilities of the private parties and the public parties. There are in the Financial Economic Committee, where there is it's a platform for cooperation between private and public parties. There is exchange on certain subject matter questions, but coming back to say the security and privacy, also the banks are very keen to make sure that the data of their clients remain within their own remit, and are not accessible for other parties, including not public parties. So the distinction between private and public, I think, will remain for a long time. And also the data remain to be owned by the banks themselves individually, and we're not going to share that with other parties, because that would also, I think, erode the public support and the public belief for this whole process. From your side, Baldwin, anything to add?
No, so I think, Nick, the legal, if you will, framework of reporting to the FIU will not change, because that's very strongly tied to international legislation, obviously. So I think that there's a lot of criticism that I hear now and then, if you talk about feedback loop from law enforcement, from FIUs to the banks to improve their financial crime frameworks or risk indicators. And I think this is a key opportunity, and I see that happening in the Netherlands more and more, to provide typologies of money laundering almost as it occurs back to TMNL and participating banks, and get a much better feedback loop to improve the analytics to detect almost on the fly new typologies of money laundering. And I think that's also a key, if you will, opportunity for TMNL.
Yeah, I think perhaps we'll look back at, previous years where, perhaps it takes many months or a year to produce a typology report, and then there's almost no awareness between industry participants about what the prevalence is of that particular typology beyond, what is filed as a suspicious activity report, as being a very strange, way to develop and test typologies. So that's very interesting. In terms of this challenge of producing higher quality reports, and it's clear to see, from your proof of concept and to understand how that can be achieved, is there a danger that there might be, a contagion effect, if you like, where the slightest level of concern from one financial institution could spread to other financial institutions, and there's effectively a bigger number of entities that are potentially excluded from the financial system? Is that a challenge, and how do you engage with that challenge?
I think the way you say it, I think you cannot deny that there might be a certain risk. So we have no idea yet at this moment whether that risk really will materialize, but it's definitely something to be keen upon. Say with private individuals in the Netherlands, everyone has a right to have a bank account. So you will have to find solutions then and have it in a very restricted manner being arranged for. If this risk would, say, materialize, say also with business relationships, we also will have to find other solutions because I think the purpose we want to achieve together is to safeguard the integrity of the financial system. The last thing the private banks want to do is to exclude clients from participating in the system. So along the way, that's also why I was talking about the journey. Along the way, we will discover new insights, and then we will discuss with all stakeholders how to find solutions. But yeah, I will not deny that certain risks, which we do not know at this moment to the full extent, might occur, but then we will have to deal with them in an appropriate way.
So Nick, what I would say on that is we have a lot of false positives in the current setup. It's a challenge for all of the banks. So it also means that, let's say, the analysts who are looking at those alerts spend most of their time looking at clients, and there's actually nothing wrong with them. So if you flip the discussion around, we talk a lot about detection of undetected criminal flows. At the same time, obviously, there's also an ambition to say, you know what, those analysts need to spend their time on really looking at criminal money, not at, let's say, regular companies or citizens where there's nothing wrong. So we also have the ambition in TMNL to really be quick in sorting false positives and reducing false positives. It also would, I would say, tone down, let's say, privacy infringement, if you will, on individuals or companies where there's actually nothing wrong. So that's a good thing. And I guess more on your question towards almost like a risk shift or almost this infection of a risk area across networks. So same thing there. I think hopefully we will be able to quickly identify false positives as such. Also infectious in the sense that there's nothing wrong with these transactions across those banks. Be assured we had a look at it. This network is okay. And at the same time in the Netherlands, we have, I would say, a legislative framework where the unbankables, if you will, are more sort of ring-fenced if you talk about the services that banks provide, rather than actually kicking them out of a bank, which is a pretty high threshold in the Netherlands to actually do that.
I think that's really interesting, because so many partnerships struggle with this potential to be more effective in prevention, but when it really comes down to it, how effective is it for even the partnership members to exit a suspicious client, and then for there to be no visibility about where that suspicious client has gone? And that's a challenge faced by partnerships outside of the Netherlands. So I think this idea of capabilities like TMNL really bringing to sharp focus, there are new capabilities available to achieve certain outcomes in the financial crime system, and for policymakers to be clear about really what they want to achieve in terms of prevention and disruption. And the idea that you have in the Netherlands that it's a very, very high threshold to debank. But there is this category of more limited financial services, I think, is an interesting one for other countries. I'd love to speak for longer. I think there's so many angles to go through here, but I note from your slides the various plateaus. So hopefully we can have additional conversations as you reach those plateaus. And thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to speak, and I am clear. It's very clear to me the passion and energy that's gone into this project and the ambition moving forward. So delighted to have you explain some of that to us today. Thank you very much.